Hello and welcome to the NCCCA monthly Our Changing Climate Series event with our special guest, distinguished climate scientist Dr. Michael Mann and journalist Steve Horn as our moderator. My name is Merrill Leeds and I am a volunteer with the North County Climate Change Alliance. For those of you who are just joining us for the first time, the NCCCA is a local San Diego-based grassroots 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to raising climate awareness and bringing about action through education, collaboration, and mobilization. A few quick announcements before we get started. First off, I would like to thank all of the individuals and organizations who have helped promoting tonight's event. You know who you are. Next, I'd like to give a big shout out to Phil Rogel, one of the NCCCA board members, who happens to be celebrating the anniversary of his 39th birthday today. Happy birthday, Phil, wherever you are in this big mob. And finally, please mark your calendars for our next event, Earth's Climate Crisis and What to Do About It, with Dr. William Calvin. That will take place on Thursday, August 13th at 5:30 p.m. Pacific time. You could go to the North County Climate Change website, the NCCCA Alliance.org to register. And that is it. Take it away, Carl.
Hey everybody, thank you for joining us today. Tonight, in your case, Dr. Mann, he's coming to us from the East Coast. We really appreciate everybody showing up today. We do have these informational presentations on the second Thursday of every month. And we usually do this in the library, in the Vista Library, but we've been doing it online since COVID has taken away our ability to meet in person. But I want to let you know that even when we are meeting in person again, we do broadcast this via our Facebook page. So if you're coming from out of town, please keep watching our newsletters and the communications that you'll get from Marion, and she'll clue you in as to when our events happen. And there's no reason why you can't participate, even though you're not close to us in San Diego County. So we do appreciate everybody coming out tonight. Again, North County Climate Change Alliance is here to help promote action for the climate. And we do also bridge a lot of the different climate groups in the area together with our alliance meetings. So we hope that you all are staying active during this time of COVID and continuing your climate action. I know I see a lot of familiar faces on from throughout the county that I do work with. So I appreciate every one of you being here. I'm going to introduce one of our guests tonight, who is a journalist. So Steve Horn is a San Diego-based reporter and a producer from the Baltimore-based nonprofit multimedia news organization, the Real News Network. He's also a reporter for he was a reporter for the Coast News, covering Escondido, San Marcos, and the North County region from mid-2018 until earlier this year. He's also a freelance investigative reporter. His work has appeared in The Guardian, The Intercept, Vice News, Capital and Maine, and other publications. He worked from 2011 through 2018, and this is my most interesting thing about Steve, that when I first met him and realized this about him, I thought this is really key. He worked from 2011 to 2018 for the climate news website dsmog.com. And that's a publication that's dedicated to investigating climate change disinformation and the fossil fuel industry influence apparatus. That means that Steve has had his finger on the pulse of climate communication and miscommunication for a long time. So that makes him a real valuable asset to our team and to our discussion tonight. So I'm going to pass it on to Steve now.
Thanks for that, Carl, and thanks. I want to just say thanks to the North County Climate Change Alliance for having me again. I was here last year for kind of a similar, different thread, but kind of a similar conversation that we had about climate change and climate change denial, and we did the film The Merchants of Doubt, which is based on the book by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. So this appearance by me again will dovetail nicely with that, and that was a great event last summer. So wanted to thank you all for having me again. And it's a great group. And what I told Carl yesterday, I think it's great that the group puts education as one of its first and foremost parts of its mission, alongside the activism that you all do in North County and throughout San Diego County. So thanks for having me. And yeah, with that, I wanted to introduce Michael Mann, the guest of honor for this hour and for as long as he wants to stay, and give a bio about him and turn over the conversation with Michael Mann. So with that said, I'm going to read a bio for Michael Mann right now. And Michael Mann is a climate scientist and professor at Penn State University. Probably many guests tonight already know about his work. He's one of the most well-renowned climate scientists in the world. That said, Michael Mann recently became a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He is, and I want to plug this, and we'll talk about it a little bit tonight, he is the author of the upcoming book, comes out January next year, titled The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. And he's the author of many other books and, of course, hundreds of studies on climate change itself, climate science. But he's the author of popular books, including The Madhouse Effect and other titles. So we'll talk a lot about that work tonight and how his work in the popular world of communicating about climate change and also his climate science and his most iconic study, I'll say, is, we'll talk about this as well, is back in over 20 years ago, where he he did a bar chart that's now known as the hockey stick, which showed the impacts of climate change if we were to continue along the same trajectory. So we'll talk about that tonight, but that's a kind of a short bio of Michael Mann. I just want to say it's an honor to be here to talk to you tonight, Michael.
Well, thanks so much, Steve. It's an honor to talk with you as well. I think we've talked before on the Real News Network,
Correct.
If I remember correctly. But it's great to have an opportunity to have sort of more of a long format conversational discussion here. And so I'm really looking forward to our conversation here and to interacting with this very great looking group of folks here that I see are listening in.
Absolutely, yeah. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for coming tonight, Michael. And I guess we'll start off the conversation with a little bit of a personal question, and that is, how did you get into becoming a climate scientist? I think that it's not a question I've heard people ask that many climate scientists, is what got you interested in the work, especially you were studying it as a PhD student. It would have been back in the 90s, right? So it's kind of a little bit after the James Hansen testimony, the famous one over 30 years ago, where he was the first climate scientist to speak before Congress, I believe in 1988, so over 30 years ago. But climate change wasn't in vogue in the same way back then as it is now. So I'm curious, like, what intellectually inspired you to want to study this daunting topic?
Yeah, thanks. So I studied physics and applied math at UC Berkeley back in the 1980s, graduated in 89, headed off to Yale University to study theoretical physics. And I thought I was going to be spending the rest of my life, studying, buried in mathematical equations and just sort of left alone to do the sorts of things that I loved doing as a scientist, solving problems, solving difficult problems. That's actually what sort of, led me to the field of physics. And I started out my graduate studies at Yale in theoretical physics, had taken my courses, passed my exams. And it's now about 1991, 2 years into the degree, and I suddenly had this sort of crisis of scientific identity, where I felt like I was getting funneled into sort of working in an area where I wasn't inspired. I just wasn't inspired by the sorts of problems that I was being given to work on in physics. And I literally opened up the catalog, the Yale University catalog of science and applied science, and started just leafing through it to see what else was going on campus, what other sorts of problems scientists were working on, where there might be an opportunity, for a scientist like myself with physics and math skills to to actually work on something sort of bigger picture. Now, there were a couple of false leads. I talked to one scientist who actually studied the behavior of hydras, these creatures that reproduce by branching. And after some discussion with him, it became clear that he wasn't really looking for a student to do the sort of interesting mathematical modeling of how, you know, these creatures reproduce. He was looking for somebody to take care of his hydras, his creatures, and I probably wasn't the right person to do that. And so I kept on sort of leafing through the catalog, and I saw that there was a professor named Barry Saltzman who was using math and physics to model Earth's climate system. And it sounded like a tremendously fascinating, huge physics problem to me. And so I would like to say that I was drawn to the science of climate change, to, you know, to help save the world, to do something about climate change, but that's not the case. It sounded like a really interesting physics problem to me. And that's why I got into it. And that's what led me ultimately to decide to do my PhD with Barry Saltzman in the Department of Geology and Geophysics, doing climate modeling and studying long-term climate records to better understand natural climate variability. My PhD thesis wasn't about climate change. It was about natural climate variability. But, and I'll, you know, I don't want this to get too lengthy, but in sort of becoming interested in investigating long-term natural climate cycles, I was led to start to look at what are known as paleoclimate proxy records, like tree rings and corals and ice cores that go far back in time, because the instrumental record, the thermometer records, only go back about 1.5 centuries. So if you're interested in long-term natural cycles, you have to turn to these other sorts of data. That's what got me interested in studying these long-term data. But ultimately, as we analyze them, and you know, in 1998, we would publish an article in the journal Nature where we would analyze these data to reconstruct past climate patterns. And though what got me interested in studying these data wasn't climate change, it was these natural climate cycles. As we analyzed the data, it became clear that these data had profound implications for climate change, because what we realized, and it's now embodied in the famous or infamous hockey stick, depending on your political persuasion, I suppose, that the warming trend of the past century, this spike that we see in the past century, had no precedent as far back as our records took us. And the shape of the curve that resulted looks like a hockey stick with the upturned blade representing this unprecedented warming trend. What I didn't realize is when we published that article in 1998, my life was about to change. You know, I was never really interested in doing anything other than science and working on interesting problems. The last thing on my mind when I double majored in applied math and physics at UC Berkeley was that I might be setting myself up for a life where I would be in the center of one of the most contentious political debates that we've ever had. But that's where I found myself because of my scientific work. The hockey stick became a symbol of climate change. I found myself under attack by many of the groups that I know, Steve, that you've studied, and the individuals that you've studied who are funded by fossil fuel interests and right-wing think tanks and front groups to attack the science and to attack the scientists. And I found myself right at the center of that. Now, a couple decades later, I've ultimately embraced that role because it's given me an opportunity to inform this very important conversation about the greatest challenge that we face as a civilization. I feel honored to be in that position, but it's the last thing I had on my mind when I first set out on this venture. So that's my short story.
Great, that's a great answer. And I guess a transition question I had for you is it gets into the whole notion of, so when you first started studying this, before this paper came out, and by the way, for the audience, I shared the paper in the chat box that Michael's is just, the famous or infamous 1998 paper that was just alluded to. So for anyone who wants to see it, that's the one. So it's in the chat box. But I wanted to ask, before this paper came out, I'm guessing that climate science was not it might have been politicized in the arenas of what to do about climate change, right? Like at the United Nations climate summits and within Congress. But among like the climate scientist community, the Ipcc, people like you, was your study, and this is a little bit discussed in the recent article that I encourage people to read in the California magazine about you, but
Oh yeah.
are you, and I'll share that in the chat box as well in a second, everyone. But would you say that, did you feel like the hockey stick was a potent enough symbol in like a way that people could understand the potential emergency that is climate change, and that's why your work came under attack? Or what do you think it was about that moment that this happened?
Yeah, I think you put your finger on it. Scientifically speaking, there already was a consensus. The second assessment report of the Ipcc, published in 1995, concluded, based on the work of my good friend Ben Santer, who is at Lawrence Livermore Labs, based substantially on his work and his colleagues. The conclusion, the sort of take-home conclusion of that second assessment report in 95 was that there was now a discernible human influence on the climate. That was sort of that was the money quote from the 1995 second assessment report. And so even though, as you alluded to earlier, Steve, there were people who were sort of ahead of their time, like James Hansen, who back in 1980, I believe it was 89, July 88 or July 88, it was July 88, where he testified to Congress that, I think the quote was, the greenhouse effect was here. What he meant was that we can now see the impact of fossil fuel burning and the warming of the planet that it's causing. But other scientists who were more conservative in a scientific sense weren't ready to conclude that. They weren't yet convinced that the signal had emerged from the noise. And so all the way through the early 90s, when I first got into climate science, up until about 95, you could legitimately be a skeptic, which is to say, based on the evidence, you could still honestly not be convinced that we had yet detected human influence on the climate. But by 1995, in the publication of that second assessment report, it was now the consensus of the world's scientists that climate change is here, it's real, it's caused by human activity. And anyone who continued to deny that was very much in the minority, and increasingly probably had an axe to grind and may well have been funded by fossil fuel interests to, foment doubt and confusion. By the mid 1990s, there really was a pretty solid consensus among the world's scientists. The hockey stick curve came out in 98. That's several years later. So there was a solid consensus, but again, I think you put your finger on it. What made that study such a lightning rod, if you will, made it, and what made that curve sort of iconic is that you didn't have to understand the abstract physics of how a climate model works or the pretty intricate statistics that people like Ben Santer were using to demonstrate, that there was a detectable signal. The curve told you everything you needed to know. You didn't need to know very much about the math or the physics or anything else to know what the hockey stick was telling us, that there clearly is this profound impact that we're having on the planet. And because of that, it was a real threat to vested interests in a way that the more abstract science wasn't, because this really, I think, communicated the reality of the threat to the public in a profound way, in some sense similar to the great Charles Keeling of UCSD and Scripps, the CO2 curve that many of you have seen, the Keeling curve, that demonstrated very clearly that we were increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And at the Scripps Museum, you can see some of the original documents and data. In the same way that curve became iconic, the hockey stick became iconic. And it was perhaps less for the science underlying it than just the story that it told to the person on the street.
Great. Yeah, I appreciate that outline of sort of the backstory on the science. And to everyone who's I guess I just wanted to plug Michael's 2013 book. He goes into this in more depth as well. It's titled "The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars: Dispatches from the Front Lines." And I just wanted to use that actually as a transition to
Yeah.
ask you a little bit about, so a couple kind of two-tiered questions. So you've done pioneering work on climate science, as we just discussed. I'm sure you've had many important contributions to the climate science debate, if you will, within the people who believe in climate change and like what the implications are. So in the science, you've had very important contributions, but you've had important contributions in the popular discourse as well. And I'm wondering, at what point did you kind of realize I want to be a little bit more part of the, not just the science. I mean, in some ways it seems like you were brought into this, as you said, involuntarily because you were attacked and the curve became such a potent symbol. But at what point did you decide, okay, well, if this is how it's going, and maybe tell me if I'm mischaracterizing it, but if this is how it's going to be, then I'm going to be in. So when, and maybe talk about like, how have you worked to communicate climate science to a more lay audience, if you will, to people who don't read climate science studies for a living?
Yeah, thanks. No, I think you sort of, the way you describe it is very much sort of the way it played out. I wasn't seeking the spotlight. I, was a science nerd who would have been very happy being left alone to do what I loved doing, which was working on interesting and difficult problems. If they had just left me alone. But when, the fossil fuel funded attack dogs went after the hockey stick and went after me personally in an effort to discredit the hockey stick, that sort of forced me into the public square. And it's an uncomfortable place to be as a scientist. There's nothing in your scientific training that trains you for that sort of battle, where the rules of engagement are no longer the ones that you learn as an academic or a scientist. In the world of science, there are certain rules of honest scientific inquiry and stating the caveats and your findings and engaging in good faith debate. That's all part of the scientific process. But the political process is quite different, where people will try to undermine you and attack you and discredit you in bad faith and by misrepresenting the data and misrepresenting your work and engaging in ad hominem attacks to try to discredit you personally as a way of discrediting your science. It's so different from the rules of engagement in science that it really takes some time to learn how to operate in that environment. And like I said, I was sort of forced into the fray, but over time I learned to not only tolerate it, but to actually to appreciate again the opportunity that it gave me. And I learned that I actually like that role, and I like explaining science to people. As a scientist, sometimes it helps you with your own understanding. If you can describe something in simpler terms, it improves your own sort of intuitive understanding of the science that you're doing. It's a useful exercise as a scientist, but I enjoy doing it. And I realized that I had this other opportunity now. It's not one that I sought out, but it was one that was available to me. Originally, I was out there in the fray defending my work, defending myself from attack, but ultimately that evolved into an opportunity to sort of engage more broadly and actually try to provide a positive vision of what the science has to say to the public and to policymakers. And I suppose to some extent, there was sort of a kernel that had been planted in my soul very early on when I was coming of age, when I was a teenager. I loved the TV series Cosmos, and Carl Sagan was sort of a hero of mine. This, amazing scientist who was an engaging communicator, and his passion for science was infectious. And so ultimately, I think there was this seed that had been planted in my youth that was able to sort of, to sprout and flourish as I realized that, hey, maybe I had an opportunity to play a similar role to the one played by this hero of mine that I grew up watching. And one of my great regrets is that I never got an opportunity to meet Carl Sagan. But on the other hand, I've had an opportunity to establish friendships with science communicators like our good friend Bill Nye, the science guy. I've had all these other opportunities now because of the road that I've gone down, and I've never looked back, even though it's not what I set out to do. And even though I had to put up with all sorts of attacks, and we can get into that, political attacks and legal attacks and threats against my life and threats against my family, you name it, it's probably been, tried. It's probably been deployed against me. Despite all of that, when people ask me, if I, had a chance to do it all over, would I make the same decisions? And I would. Because again, at the risk of repeating myself, I can think of no greater privilege than being in a position to inform this conversation that we're having writ large. And I'm going to try to keep my subsequent answers shorter so we can get in more questions here.
Sure. And I just want to encourage everyone who's attending to put your questions in the box as well. And we'll turn to those in a little bit. I'll ask a question just to inform a little bit of the discussion and sort of situate ourselves today. And that is, and you said this in the California Magazine article, you described it well, but I think maybe it'd be useful to hear a little bit of maybe a finer point on it, or describe what this means maybe. And that is, in the California Magazine article that came out recently, you had said the models that came out in 1998 that you were churning out back then, and the science that you've been doing since has pretty much shown that the hockey stick has kind of borne out, and the end of the stick is just getting longer and going upwards. So if you can talk about like that a little bit more, and sort of where we are in summer 2020 on the state of climate science.
Yeah, it's a great question. There was just an interview earlier today. There's a new WMO, and it's the World Meteorological Organization. And to my knowledge, Trump hasn't yet pulled out of the WMO, although he's pulled out of the World Health Organization. But the World Meteorological Organization is another international organization that compiles environmental data, atmospheric and oceanic data, and climate data. And they came out today with a calculation that's been done by some scientists that, first of all, over the last 12 months, if you look at the average temperature of the planet, we're now at for this month, about 1.4 degrees Celsius. It's, the better part of 3 degrees Fahrenheit, 1.4 degrees Celsius above sort of the pre-industrial level. And 1.5 degrees Celsius, many of you are probably familiar with that number, because that's the number that the international community, and the Ipcc, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, we've sort of converged on this number, 1.5 degrees Celsius, a little less than 3 Fahrenheit, is sort of really a threshold that we don't want to go beyond. If we go beyond that amount of warming, we really start to see the worst impacts of climate change. And here we are this month at 1.4. Now you have to unpack this a little bit. It doesn't mean we're about to cross the 1.5 degree threshold, because there's the warming trend, the long-term warming trend, and then there's a lot of erratic variability on top of that. There are fluctuations up and down. And as it happens, we're sort of in an upward fluctuation. So we've got this ramp, we're on this ramp, and then there's a positive fluctuation that takes us even higher. We're getting very close to, to the point where for an individual year, we might cross that 1.5 degree threshold. But what we really don't want to have happen is that the warming trend itself, the sort of moving baseline, we don't want that to cross 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we're probably only, 1 to 2 decades away from that now. But this is a taste of how close we've come now, where for individual months and even years, we're starting to bump up against that number. And if we don't bring those carbon emissions down dramatically, then we will be sort of permanently past that 1.5 threshold. And that's where we really start to see the worst impacts on the melting of the ice sheets and rising sea level and coral bleaching and everything else that's happening. So we are, the hockey stick, the blade is getting longer and longer. And what we don't want that blade to do is to go past 1.5 degrees Celsius. What does that mean in practice? It means we need to bring our carbon emissions down by a factor of 2 within the next 10 years. That's about 10% a year, okay, for the next 10 years. It's more than 5% a year for the next 10 years. And the coronavirus lockdown, and it feels like, our sort of, our lifestyles have changed so dramatically. We've reduced transportation, air travel, and all of that dramatic change in lifestyle, the lockdown is only brought carbon emissions down for the year. They're going to be about 4% lower because of the coronavirus lockdown. So that tells you just what a challenge it is. Even this fundamental shift in behavior this year in response to this pandemic, in what feels like a dramatic reduction in our usage of fossil fuels, isn't even enough to get us where we need to get. And so we need structural change. Changes in behavior alone aren't going to get us there. We really need to decarbonize our civilization, and we need to do it quickly.
Well, yeah, and that gets into, and I want to talk about the sort of the core. I'm going to try to tie two things together here. The corollary of denierism, which is tackled a little bit in, I think it's a big, maybe not a little bit, maybe it's a major topic in your forthcoming book, and I know that you spoke about it in a California Magazine article. But the concept of, so we were just talking about denialism and the climate denial apparatus, which has been, the attack dogs, if you will. But there's another side, and I know you've never equated them. You were very careful in the California Magazine article to say that it's not the same, but it's still problematic in some ways. And that is what you call doomerism. That is that we are in a very, we accept climate change, but it's just so bad and it's so overwhelming that there's nothing that we can do about it. And that's somewhat of a mentality that you say has gripped some parts of the climate debate. So if you don't mind to talk about that, and I guess I'd like to maybe just use a case study, if you will, and that is the real impacts of climate change, and something that you studied in, you've seen throughout your time doing this science, but you came across it in particular when you were in Australia on sabbatical. And that is kind of an example where we are actually seeing climate change bear out in reality. So I think it's fair to say that people, when they see the real impacts of climate change, it's probably a natural inclination to have this doomerist mentality, if you will, when you see these horrifying realities that climate change is already creating. So if you can kind of, that's what I was meant about dovetailing those two things. But I'm just curious to hear your point of view on that.
Yeah. So, we talk about what's the line where we reach dangerous climate change. Is it 1.5 C Celsius warming? Is it 2 degrees Celsius warming? That's all academic as far as I'm concerned at this point, because if you live in California, dangerous climate change has arrived. Okay. If you live in Australia, dangerous climate change has arrived. If you live in Puerto Rico, dangerous climate change has arrived. Houston, North Carolina, and the list goes on. We're already seeing dangerous climate change impacts, particularly with the unprecedented destructive weather extremes that we've seen around the world in recent years. And so at this point, on the one hand, that's bad, but in some ways, it's almost it's almost liberating. And what I mean by that is, it's at this point, yeah, we're already committed to bad stuff. So it's too late to have the debate about what's necessary to prevent dangerous impacts. The real conversation is, how bad are we willing to let it get? It's not a cliff that we go off at 1.5 C or 2 C. It's a dangerous highway that we're driving down, and we may miss the 1.5 degree exit. That doesn't mean that we don't try to get off at the 1.6 exit. And if we miss that, we still try to get off at the 1.7 exit. So it's not, people sometimes, and I often come up against this question, are we effed? The F word, and the answer is, that's the wrong question. It's how effed do we want to allow ourselves to be? And we can still prevent a lot of the damage. And to me, that's liberating. What it means is that there is urgency, but there's also agency. We have a great degree of control when it comes to preventing it from getting worse. And so to me, that is really important. You have to pair the urgency with the agency. If you just tell people things are awful and you tell them there's nothing we can do about it, which is wrong, then that leaves them nowhere. That leads people down a path of inaction that is disabling, and ultimately leads them to the same place as outright denial, right? If you really don't believe there is any agency in your actions, that there's anything you can do about it, then why do anything? And here's why that is so pernicious. It's an understandable reaction by people of good faith who are honestly overwhelmed by, what we're experiencing and what we're dealing with. But it is exploited by the forces of denial, by the forces of inaction. I call them the inactivists. They exploit that, and at times they actually amplify that messaging. And I'll tell you why. Because what they need to prevent us from decarbonizing, getting off fossil fuels, what the fossil fuel industry and their enablers need, they need to divide the public. They need us divided when it comes to what actions to take. The conservative, the sort of political right, they've pretty much already got on board. What doomism allows them to do is to actually buy off some on the left side of the spectrum, to convince people who are genuinely concerned that, hey, there's nothing we can do anyways. So don't bother engaging, don't bother being active and advocating for change. It's a way of suppressing, activism. And so I think that's why it's so dangerous, and that's why it's so important for us to recognize. And that's what my new book, The New Climate War, is about. It's about the evolving tactics of the forces of inaction, as we've gotten to the point where nobody can claim with a straight face that climate change isn't happening, or that we're not seeing pretty devastating impacts. So instead, they've engaged in this agenda of distraction, deflection, that, hey, the problem is you. It's not the fossil fuel industry. It's you eating hamburgers and you flying in. And it is important for us to take some personal responsibility in reducing our individual carbon footprints. But there's an effort, and it goes way back to what the beverage industry did in the 1970s, the tobacco industry. There's so many examples of these so-called deflection campaigns where industry special interests have tried to convince us that the problem is us, not them. We don't need to regulate tobacco. We don't need to regulate guns. We don't need any laws. We just need people to behave better. And they're doing that right now in the climate arena as well. And so while it's important for us to be good stewards and engage in efforts to reduce our carbon emissions, reduce our carbon footprint, it sets a good example, makes us feel better, it's the right thing to do. We can't allow that to be a substitute for holding policymakers accountable for implementing policies that create larger incentives so that everybody moves in the right direction, that people make the right decisions because there's an incentive to do that. That was a long-winded answer too, sorry.
Great answer. Yeah, and I just want to contextualize what you said a little bit more, just and feel free to respond to it if you want to it, because it kind of speaks to the changing tone a little bit within the Republican Party. And I'm just going to use an example of Arizona Governor Doug Ducey in our neighboring state to the east, and that is when he was running for office, he was pretty much a straight out climate denier. He said that humans have nothing to do with climate change, and that was the line. I think there's an evolving line now with Republicans that speaks to what you were saying about, well, what are we going to do about it? So here's what Doug Ducey said. He said, "It's going to get warmer here. What I am skeptical about is what human activity has." Oh, this is what he said. What I'm skeptical about is what human activity has to do with. That was back then. Now he's saying, this is his current stance. The skepticism isn't so much around causes, it's around suggested remedies. And I feel like that's probably the new territory that we're
absolutely into. Absolutely. Yep.
And one other thing I just want to plug before I'm going to turn it to Meryl and Carl to maybe ask a question, but that is, just to speak a little bit about, you mentioned the beverage industry. I just want to put on the map for those who are watching to check out the documentary by PBS, Plastic Wars. That speaks a little bit to this whole notion of this personal responsibility and what the plastics industry did to convince people that if you only recycled, that would be a huge part of the solution. And that allowed the plastics industry to produce so much of this petrochemical product that is so much of a hazard today. And it's now become a big issue in the United States around fracking and these petrochemical facilities that are popping up around the United States. So I think that's a parallel to another example of this whole notion of personal responsibility. If you just do this, then things will be great. And that was a industry perpetuated narrative as well by some of the big players.
Well, I have to tell one very short story now that you mentioned that. I can't resist. And I think with this crowd here, I think many of you remember the commercial in the early 1970s, the Crying Indian the public service announcement, that we was all about stewardship and cleaning up our bottle and can litter. And it, felt empowering to people. When I was growing up, I was just a young kid when that commercial was playing, and it's like, yeah, we gotta, and it felt like a good thing. And it's like, it's a great message. But actually it was propaganda from the beverage industry, because they were trying to prevent the passage of the bottle bills. And this was a way of deflecting attention from, no, we don't need a regulatory solution. We don't need a bottle bill. No, we Coca-Cola don't need to recycle and reprocess this bottle and can litter. We just need people to behave better. And so that was a deflection campaign. And they actually, there were a number of environmental organizations that actually fell prey to it, and originally actually were co-sponsors until they realized that it was actually a PR campaign hatched on Madison Avenue by Coca-Cola to kill the bottle bills. And as a result, as you alluded to, and we never got, some states have them. The blue states tend to have bottle bills, but there isn't a national bottle bill. Most states don't have a bottle bill. And as a result, in part of their successful campaign, we have this other great environmental problem in the world, which is global plastic pollution. You can thank Coca-Cola and the beverage industry for that. And they're trying to do the same thing on climate right now. And so in my book, I actually spend quite a bit of time talking about the Crying Indian PSA, because it's just a classical example of what we're talking about. But I do want to get to the questions folks have, and also some of the folks online, make sure we can get to a few of those.
Absolutely, and I'm going to turn it over to Carl and Meryl, because I'm not sure if they have a question or not, or how they want to proceed. Yeah. But let's turn it to
I'll really try hard to keep my answers short.
No worries.
Okay, so this is Carl. Thanks, Dr. Mann. First of all, I wanted to point out that we do have a member here today that's calling in from Australia, a young woman who works for Fighters for Future. So we really
Good on you,
appreciate
mate.
it. Yeah, this is a pretty big audience in that respect. So I want to ask something that I think maybe would resonate with her. This is a question I prepared. Looking outside the USA, populations appear to understand and accept the science of climate crisis better. Thinking of Greta Thunberg and the youth climate strikes in Europe and in Australia, are you convinced that accepting the problem as real is actually making those populations and their leaders mobilize to combat climate crisis with major action? Or are they in the second phase of denial, or action yet isn't really understood to be their responsibility? In other words, they're not really ready to drop everything and act like it's an emergency.
Yeah, it's a great question. I actually think that the youth climate movement is really one of the, it's the breakthrough we've all been waiting for, because it's shifted the whole conversation to where it should have been in the first place. This isn't just about science, economics, politics. This is about ethics and what sort of planet we want to leave behind for our children and grandchildren. And thanks to Greta and the other youth climate leaders, they've really recentered the conversation there. And what I like about their messaging is that it's a comprehensive sort of criticism that they're providing. Greta talks about personal responsibility, and she, took a boat to New York rather than fly, and she doesn't fly to try to minimize her carbon footprint. And that tends to get a lot of attention, I think, in part for some of the reasons we were talking about. It's convenient for people to focus that on that. It's for special interest to focus on that aspect of her, of what she does. And that's why it gets so much attention. But what she's really doing is she's speaking truth to power, and she's calling out bad actors and politicians and opinion leaders who are failing to lead. And, I think that these kids, Greta and the rest of them, they just speak with such moral purity that it's so difficult. The fossil fuel interests don't know what to do about them. They've tried attacking them, criticizing them. That's not a good look. OPEC has said that Greta Thunberg and the other youth climate leaders are the greatest threat. OPEC, this consortium of international oil producers, of petrostates, has said Greta Thunberg is the greatest threat that we face. That means the eye of Sauron is focused on these kids, and we can't put it all on them. What they've done is they've sort of put a foot in the door for the rest of us, and now we have to take over and make sure that their efforts aren't in vain. And so I'm actually optimistic that, we really could be in a position within the next year to make some real progress here. I think we're going through a tipping point, in part because of the youth climate movement, but also because of sort of the reaction, the pushback against sort of the politics of Trumpism and his assault on environmental protections. I think there's sort of a perfect storm taking hold here, which will put us in a position to make real progress within the next year. That's one of the reasons that I'm cautiously optimistic, despite all of the challenges and the dangerous impacts that we're seeing. I feel like we're going through a societal tipping point, and it's not going to happen if we all don't push forward. So it's a critical moment for all of us, and for you folks, for environmental organizations who are trying to help organize the populace to make sure we act now.
I want to give Merrill a chance to ask a question, because he was responsible for helping bring you to our group.
Thank you, Dr. Mann. And again, thanks for being here. This is actually a question that I came up with, but it's been touched upon by somebody in our audience tonight in one of their chat questions, particularly in the area of biomass. My question is, nuclear energy, biomass, and geoengineering continue to be a highly controversial method, or highly controversial methods of reducing and drawing down CO2 while making a timely transition from fossil extraction to renewables. How do you envision the roles that these potentially dangerous technologies might play in our quest to eliminate excess GHG from our atmosphere?
Yeah, Well, I think it's an appropriately loaded question, which is to say, my answer to the question is sort of in the framing, in the way the question was framed. These are dangerous, geoengineering, tampering with, the only planet in the universe we know that can support us and other life. There is no planet B, as we all like to say. And the idea that we should tamper in an uncontrolled and unprecedented way with the planet in a way that could potentially make things even worse, it sort of violates, our oath, the oath to first do no harm. It applies to human health and doctors and the medical profession, but it applies to the planet as well. And I think geoengineering violates that oath. I think nuclear energy comes with similar risks, and it would be one thing. These things would all be worth talking about if we didn't have a better solution, but we do. Renewable energy, wind, solar, geothermal. And my good friend Mark Jacobson up at Stanford, some of you are probably familiar with his work, the Climate Solutions Project. They've got the Hulk. Mark Ruffalo is on board with this project as well. And Mark, in his peer-reviewed work, has put forward a blueprint for how to do this, and has demonstrated we can meet 80% of projected energy need by energy demand by 2030 and 100% by 2050 with renewables. We just need incentives to scale that up. We need to level the playing field so that renewable energy can compete fairly against fossil fuel energy. We continue to provide subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, which is a complete it's a distortion of the incentive structure that is necessary. And so if we level the playing field, if we incentivize and scale up renewable energy, that's the solution. We don't have to engage in these other potentially very dangerous behaviors. It's convenient for some special interests to try to distract us with these other fake solutions. And that's a theme in the new climate war as well. Fake solutions to distract us from the real one. And so that's my short answer.
Dr. Mann, we're about reaching the end of the hour, and I know we promised to stay with you for an hour. Do you have just a few minutes more for us?
Absolutely. Let's get in a few questions from folks who have been so patiently in the audience here.
Okay, cool. So this one's a pretty general question. So feel free to, think outside the box here. This is from a 17-year-old in our audience. And I keep going back to these young people because I think we have not heard enough of their voices in the main argument of what are we supposed to do. We hear their voices in that you need to do something. She's asking, I'm a 17-year-old school student. What is your best advice for students my age? What should she be doing?
I'm tempted to say plastics. No, some of you will get that joke, and I'm dating myself here. No, I would say you guys are doing the right. The youth are doing what needs to be done. They're speaking truth to power, holding the rest of us accountable because they're not yet in a position of leadership and authority where they can influence a process that is determining what sort of planet they and their children and grandchildren will inherit. And so, we need to be listening. We need to do the bidding of our youth because they're not in a position to vote and to pressure law. They can pressure lawmakers, and they're doing that. But they're not yet in sort of positions of power and influence where they can have the sort of impact that the rest of us can. So I would say to her, continue speaking truth to power. Don't be afraid to speak out and to use your voice in every way that is imaginable. And I am just delighted at the way that the youth of this country, it's not just on climate, it's on common sense gun reform, and the sort of the TikTok teens and the the K-pop stands, and the inventive ways that the youth of America are influencing the conversation. I think of the Trump Tulsa rally, and how these TikTok kids and the K-pop folks, they helped expose him and his enablers for the fools, the dangerous fools that they are, through some pretty inventive online maneuvering. And so I say, just keep on doing what you guys are doing, and don't be afraid to assert your right to be part of the decision making that's going to determine the health of the planet for you and future generations. And allow that to guide what you decide to spend your life doing. The other thing I would say, it took me a long time to figure it out, what I really wanted to do. Listen to your heart. It's easy to sort of listen to your brain and do, what comes naturally. And when I majored in applied math and physics, that was the stuff that came naturally. I eventually found my way and ended up, in the center of the climate sort of discussion, in part by listening to my heart. And so use your head, but listen to your heart as well, and find your way, and find what it is that plays to your strengths and your interests, that allows you, as my good friend Bill Nye likes to say, to change the world. Bill says, change the world. I modify that, change the world for the better.
Thank you. I'm going to shift gears now and get nerdy on you. We have a member that likes to ask this question.
I love it when people get nerdy. All right, yes.
Okay, all right, hold on to your butts, everybody. So why does the IPCC, this is a question from Cody Harrison, one of our members. Why does the IPCC say that wetter soil decreases the severity of heat waves, and that increased vegetation reduces regional warming, yet these potential pressure points for stabilizing regional climate don't seem to be making it into local climate action plans? So this is sort of from your IPCC experience.
Yeah.
Do you see changes in what the science understands versus what's being recommended?
Yeah, so no, I think there is some consistency. It's it's such a cacophonous conversation, the climate conversation, that sometimes it all gets very confusing. People throw up their hands, and it's just almost in frustration. But no, there are some common themes in terms of what the science tells us and what is being recommended. Green spaces in urban locations, that the motivation for green spaces is very much the underlying science that you were just speaking to. The fact that vegetation helps retain moisture, that reduces warming. This is one way to help reduce urban warming, because urban environments are warming faster because of the heat retaining properties of cement, of blacktop, asphalt. And so greening those locations in San Diego, would be a good example of an urban, region that can benefit from greening. It does help retain moisture. Moisture, there was a question about the physics of that, or the science of that. Why is that true? Why does increased soil moisture help keep temperatures down? Well, because if you've got moisture, then some of that heat is going to go into evaporating the moisture. And the heat that's going into the evaporation of the moisture, we call that latent heat, isn't available to become what we call sensible heat, warming. So some of the heating is going into evaporating the moisture. And we all know this from, I think there's probably a fair amount of this in San Diego, certainly in Phoenix, Arizona in the summer. If you're eating outside, they spray water to try to keep things cooler. That's because some of the heating then goes into evaporating the water rather than heating you up. So it does make sense. There is good underlying science for why we want green spaces, why we'd like to try to green our environment writ large as much as possible. That includes reforestation, afforestation. There are lots of reasons to do this, but it helps with the climate problem as well. And we need policies that incentivize that, particularly in urban regions. We need policies that incentivize reforestation and afforestation. And there is a fair amount of conversation about that these days, is that being part of a comprehensive climate solution.
Great, thank you. And Cody's going to be thrilled that you actually attacked the question, so thank you. Okay, here's another one that came in early when I did offer for folks to ask questions. How does the melting in Siberia and the forest fires, how do they fit in with the climate change models that you've worked on?
Yeah, so, there's been there have been statements out there, for example, that the models say we weren't supposed to see this until 2100. And again, that can lead to, again, sort of doomist prophecies like, oh my God, we're already where we're supposed to be 100 years from now or 80 years from now. And what are we going to do? And so it's important to sort of to keep it real with the science. And while, I spend most of my time debunking the myths and misinformation of denialists, at times I do take to task those who are misstating the science in a way that portrays things as far more apocalyptic than they are. And then there are important reasons to do that. One is just that, hey, we want to be informed by good science. We don't want to be guilty of the same thing the other side is, of distorting the science for an agenda. So let's be true to the science, because you know what? The scientific evidence as it stands is more than enough argument for acting dramatically to do something. We don't need to exaggerate it. And so, yeah, it's worrying that we're seeing triple digit, over 100-degree Fahrenheit temperatures in Siberia at this point. But actually, it is a new record that we saw, but it beat the old record by, only several tenths of a degree. So it isn't like this is somewhere we haven't been before. And it isn't like the models say this isn't supposed to happen yet. This is what happens. When you warm up the planet, you see more frequent heat extremes, more intense and frequent heat waves. And there was a study just a week ago showing that we're seeing that in the data. So what we're seeing happen is consistent with the model projections, and that's bad enough. And those same model projections are the basis for the conclusion that there is still time to avert the worst impacts. Again, if we bring those carbon emissions down pretty rapidly in the decades ahead.
Thank you. Switching gears here a little bit, you've had a lot of experience dedicating all your waking hours to this. I'm not sure, do you lecture anymore, or are you really just doing a lot of research now in communications?
Oh, you mean during the lockdown?
Yeah.
I'm doing a lot of what we're doing right here,
Yeah.
and I continue to enjoy it. Yeah.
Yeah. So the question was, how do you handle your mental health when you know with certainty that our world will just come under more and more stress? And I know this is kind of bridging with what your concerns were about. Let's not dive into doomerism, but how do you treat that in your own life, and maybe the people around you that have to deal with the fact that this is what you do?
Yeah. So, it would be difficult to get up in the morning if I truly believed that it was too late for us to do anything. So what keeps me going is the knowledge, and knowledge based on being informed on the science, that it isn't too late to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. To me, that's motivating. It's a reason to motivate people to act, because, at the risk of repeating myself again, there is great urgency, but there is agency. It's not too late for us to act. And the only, at this point, to sort of almost riff off of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the only thing to fear is fear itself. The only, thing that ensures doom is doomist thinking at this point. And so that's perhaps the greatest threat we face, as outright denial sort of slowly disappears. Sure, there's still climate deniers out there, but they're increasingly irrelevant. The conversation is moving on. And what we have to contend with are some of these other very pernicious efforts to keep us from acting, and the way that some of these same fossil fuel interests and those doing their bidding are trying to lead us down a path of despair and deflection and delay. They're doing everything they can because their business model is that they continue to make billions of dollars every day we remain addicted to fossil fuels. So they're going to try to delay. They can't stop it. They can't stop us from acting. They know that now. They're just trying to delay it as much as they can. But with that delay comes great cost for all of us. And so I guess to me, that is almost understanding that and recognizing that there's still an opportunity to act, and recognizing that there's such important work to be done in sort of combating the forces of delay and inaction. To me, that's very motivating, and I hope it's motivating for all of us here. The knowledge that it isn't too late to act, and that our actions are making a difference. That what you guys are doing is making a difference.
So this is a question that I think we've heard some other folks talk about who we've interviewed, but I think it's worth asking you. Is there any use anymore in debating with climate deniers? Should we just focus that energy on removing them from political power? And I'm sure that if you're writing about communication, you must have to deal with the folks that are still, I saw someone online today talking about flat Earth. They're out there. Do we spend time talking to them? Is there any hope in convincing these people?
So my answer to the original question is no and yes. No, don't waste your time with them. They're an increasingly irrelevant fringe who would like to, they would gladly have you wasting all your time in fruitless efforts to win them over, when that time and effort could better be spent explaining, informing sort of what I call the confused middle. The people who aren't ideologically opposed, but they're genuinely confused by all the misinformation, and they would gladly become part of the solution were they to become appropriately informed. That's where our focus should be. So yeah, ignore the deniers at this point, to the extent that their claims are infecting the larger discourse. It's important at times to rebut their misinformation and disinformation, but don't get don't get caught up in don't get dragged down into a mud fight with them, because as a famous saying, you get dirty and don't get in a mud fight with a pig. You get dirty and the pig likes it. So don't waste your time on them. Spend that time bringing along people who are genuinely ready to be and willing to be part of the solution.
Well, Dr. Mann, I want to thank you for answering all these questions with us tonight and having this discussion. It's been super helpful, insightful. I look forward to reading your book and finding how your evolution of doing this work with other people, that should really help us and inform us about how we advocate and help change people's minds, because we do understand that you're coming from that at that nexus where you have to do that all the time. And as advocates here at the local level, we have to really understand how to do that effectively. And so I'm looking forward to, finding out the insight that you have to share with us. I do have something that I want to share with you that is coming to us via, can you guys see my screen?
Thank you. That's a good looking tree. Is that my tree?
This is your tree. So we would like to extend to you that we have planted a tree in your name and a national forest. And we thank you very, very much for spending the time talking with us today. And I think you're helping to inspire people that, I spoke with some people already in the chat today about, how can I help? So just your presence in having this Q&A with us here today is helping to get more people involved. We've recorded it and we'll put it out there on the web, and I think other people will enjoy hearing your perspective on things. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and it's great to know that all you folks are out there on the front lines with me fighting this battle. It means a lot to be able to have these conversations with people who are so engaged and working so hard towards our common goal here. So thanks, everybody. I look forward to eventually seeing my tree. I'll come out there to see it, and let's do it again sometime.
And I tell folks, don't go away, because we are going to continue on with Steve. But thank you very much, Dr. Mann, for spending time with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mann. It's great. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
For our next part of our presentation tonight, we are going to continue on with Steve. Like I said, Steve's got a lot of experience, both writing about climate and then also really digging into investigative stories in that writing. So definitely a lot of insight. And Meryl, if you'd like to lead off with a question for Steve, maybe we can keep the conversation going. And I'm going to stop sharing here.
Okay.
And if you don't have one, Meryl, I can start with something too to kick things off. Up to you. I can situate it if you want.
Sure,
Okay.
I can address the question to you later then.
Sure. How about what I'll do is I shouldn't have said maybe it'd be easier. What I'll do for everyone is I just want to play a 1.5-minute clip from just to kind of show the type of work that I do at the Real News Network. A recent thing that's on my mind is the wildfires in Arizona. They're just a little bit of background because you won't see it all in the video, but Arizona, it kind of got lost in the news, but I think everyone here from California in particular will be interested in this. Arizona in June had 3 of its 10 biggest wildfires in state history all happening at the same time. And of course, this is happening during the coronavirus. So there are concerns that the smoke from the fire could exacerbate their already terrible situation with their upswell of coronavirus cases and stuff. So that's sort of what the basis of this video piece was. And the Real News Network, a little bit of background, is a video news website first and foremost. I said multimedia because we started doing more print, but it got its start as video news. And most of, probably 85% of our stuff is still video. So my background is as a print investigative reporter, and I've started doing video and video production and writing starting in the beginning of 2019. And what we were doing at the Real News Network at that time, we don't call it that anymore because I think it was a little bit of an exaggeration for how small our staff was, but we were calling it the Climate Crisis Bureau. And we still call it, whenever we talk about the climate change, we don't call it necessarily climate change. We're talking about the issue itself. We call it the climate crisis, which is becoming more and more of a thing in the news. The Guardian now refers to it as the climate crisis, and increasingly news outlets are calling it the climate crisis, not just climate change, just like we call it the opioid epidemic or the opioid crisis. Obviously, climate change is at crisis level, so we might as well call it what it is. So with that said, I just want to show a little bit of this 1.5 minutes just to kind of get the ball rolling, and kind of, this is the most recent thing that I've done for the Real News. So I'll play the first 1.5 minutes, and California is part of it as well. So it's not only about Arizona, it's you'll see, but I'll share my screen in a second here. Getting it launched up, everyone.
Let's make sure.
Oh, sorry. Okay, sharing my screen for everyone. Share it. And making sure that you all can see.
You can see it.
Okay, great. Carl, real quick, is there another thing I pressed that it looks okay for you said that to optimize the quality?
I'm not sure you can do it from that screen, so we'll just try it.
Okay, if it's bad quality, sorry everyone, but I'm going to press play, and here we go.
That we have these fire crews that are ready, and not base this strategy on a hope that we're going to just be hit in a manner and in an order that we can track and stay on top of, because Mother Nature doesn't usually care.
Historically, large wildfires were bad enough. Then COVID-19 entered the scene. A combination of the two, the stuff of nightmares. Arizona is experiencing it. They have forced thousands to evacuate. That, the other two fires, over 60,000 acres in size, have burned through close to 400,000 acres as of June 22nd. California, too, has already seen more wildfires this year than in all of 2019. And Governor Gavin Newsom said at a May press conference,
we just ran some numbers from January to May 10th last year. We had 675 wildfires. From January to May 10th this year, we've had 1,135 wildfires. Represents roughly a 60% increase this year compared to last year in the total number of wildfires.
and climate change is at the center of it all.
The hots are getting hotter, the dries are getting drier, the wets are getting wetter. There's a new reality. For those that don't believe in climate change or science, I remind them, come to California, visit us, learn about climate change firsthand.
Compound.
Okay, so that's it. I'm gonna now not share my screen so you can see me. You can see me now. Is that correct, Carl? Is it me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So that's a background. That's sort of just an example of the type of work that we do. And the last thing I'll say is we always try to frame it from, I think it's increasingly important today, as we've seen also erupt in June, is these issues around race. And so that's a huge focus of ours, is environmental justice, and has been from the start. And so is class, like explaining who's causing the climate crisis and that we have these inequalities in our society, and it's kind of unequal who's actually causing the crisis, whether it be corporations or political or economic elites. So that's just a little bit of a background in what we do. I just wanted to put that out there and sort of show some of the latest work. And I encourage people to check out that whole video. It was about 8 minutes long. It was a kind of a mini documentary, if you will. So with that said, I'm open for questions from both our co-moderators and the audience.
Okay, if I might start. The Real News Network and other news outlets have increasingly taken more proactive positions in the dissemination of climate news. Yet the level of awareness among our populations is still much lower than required to exert the pressure needed for systematic changes on a national and worldwide scale. Given the gravity of our situation, what more can be done by the media to combat climate lethargy?
I just want to say, this goes back to the whole thing with the Real News, and we called it the Global Climate Crisis Bureau. Kind of became a misnomer, because how can you have a bureau when you only have a few people? And we do what we can, but that said, it spoke at the time, this was in 2017, it spoke to the lack of coverage, this concerted effort to have full-time staffed up climate desks. It's still a relatively new phenomenon within newsrooms, and it's becoming more common. And I'll answer your question about I think that this speaks to how do we get to that point that there's more people concerned about this threat. There's a new effort that Columbia Journalism Review started alongside The Nation magazine last year called Covering Climate Now. And those who are watching right now can check that out on Google if you just type in Covering Climate Now. It's a concerted effort by newsrooms around the entire world to cover this topic with the seriousness it deserves on a day-to-day basis. And that speaks to what you asked, Meryl, which is, it is a huge issue, but political leaders still don't quite act like it, both in the United States and around the world. And some of that is because it hasn't been a major focus of newsrooms. I'm not saying that the news doesn't cover it, but it hasn't really been framed in that this is a climate crisis or this is a climate emergency and here's what it looks like. And I think that is the whole, like the Covering Climate Now look at it, is that's the starting point of this. This is a climate crisis and this is a climate emergency, and here's the impacts that it's having, and here's sort of the things that are causing it. Here's the people that are causing it. Here's the companies that are causing it. Whatever the causes are, it's looking at cause and effect. It's looking at who it's impacting. And I think that, it's encouraging that this Covering Climate Now thing started. There was a big, on Earth Day, hundreds upon hundreds of stories that were published under that banner, where they have these these weeks where that happens. But in reality, it's not enough just to have like a week here or a week there. I think it needs to be something in the hardest thing is the media, the news landscape is falling by the wayside, especially locally, and financing and all of that. We're seeing local journalists around the country lose their jobs, and that's where you see, that's how people can really connect to the climate crisis, is seeing how it's impacting their own community. We're losing those journalists. That's a problem, but we're going to need to, hopefully the news industry can come around where every major metropolitan area and every community local newspaper has someone who's focusing, or people who are focusing on the climate crisis. I think that would go a long way to creating that upswell of concern about the issue where things actually start to happen. And with all that said, I'm not blaming the media or anything for it, but of course the news media is how a lot of people, most people learn about these issues, and that's like that's how people connect it to their day-to-day life. So it's both an encouraging trend that we see, this Discovering Climate Now sort of trend, but also a little bit discouraging and very sad that we're seeing so many local reporters around the country lose their jobs. And that's how still the majority of people around the country get their news. And then that's the news that people trust the most, as well as their local newspaper, if you look at polling. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but I do think that the news media has a key role to play there.
Very encouraging. Carl?
Oh, okay. Thanks. We're passing back and forth a little bit. Thank you. Steve, I wanted to ask you about China. So you've been covering climate for a long time, but you went to China not to cover climate, but for a completely different reason. We have folks in the community that when we talk about climate change and climate crisis, we hear the response back, well, what's the point of the United States doing anything if China's just going to be out there polluting the world? Like, until they do something, we don't need to bother. What's your perspective on China, and did you get any new insights when you visited?
Don't know why I muted myself, but I'm sorry about that, everyone. Yeah, so my wife is from China, and I took a trip, my first trip there in October. And I'll just a little bit, I'm not speaking that much from, I'll get into a little bit more systemic things at the second part of my answer. But the first part of my answer is that it was really fascinating from a San Diego or Southern California point of view. And those who live in San Diego County will know that one of the big climate issues for us is not so much how are we going to stop this oil drilling in the county, or how are we going to stop this offshore drilling, like is the case in some other areas in California. But a big concern here is sprawl housing and this issue of so much car traffic. 41% of the state's climate emissions in California come from automobiles, and it's a big. This issue of sprawl is probably the number one issue that a lot of climate activists work on here, and that brings me to China. A huge difference between there and the big city like San Diego and other places in California at large is the sprawl pattern of housing just doesn't exist, and that's by necessity. There's so many people, and so you see urban areas set up just completely differently than, well, we'll just use California as the example. You see more people who are on their bikes. There's bike lanes. I mean, you go to Beijing, there's bike lanes all around the city. There's like an actual carved out spot on each side of the street for that, or small motor vehicles, not quite motorcycles, but like mopeds. There are kind of much wider sidewalks, so it's much more pedestrian friendly, and more public, kind of a lot more green space in cities where people can go. That said, I'm not trying to say that China doesn't have pollution issues and issues with their coal industry and all of that, and I'll get to that in a second. But it just points to the fact that they're living. So, and that gets the other part about the high. They live in mostly high-rise condos. These kind of like 1,000 square feet to 1,200 square feet would be a normal size for a family of four, for example. That's just how it is, and that's sort of the style that we're talking about more and more here in California, but it's not happening, which is this infill type building where it's a much greener mode of housing. It gets people closer to where they work, and of course all of their housing is, and the way that these big cities are set up, they have much more public transit. And that's the other thing that just doesn't exist in a very convenient way in San Diego. That speaks to the ongoing debate here over the 5 big moves, as it's called, within SANDAG, or the San Diego Association of Governments, which is to boost up our public transit. But a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in San Diego already exists and has existed for a long time in China. We don't hear about that as much in the U.S. media, because that gets to the other part, is there's so much talk about, oh, they produce so much coal and there's so much pollution and look at the air quality. All of that is true, but we need to take a step back from that. Carl and I were talking about it yesterday. A big reason why that kind of pollution exists, is not the only reason. Of course, there are corporate interests that just want to make money, but also, like, you have to look at it from a global perspective. As Carl and I were talking about yesterday, the fact that China is like the global manufacturing epicenter. It's where cheap stuff is produced so that people in the Western world can buy it on the cheap. And of course, that means that the labor is being exploited, serious human rights issues with that, and just the ability to conduct day-to-day life for people who have those jobs. But that is a big causer of a lot of the issues itself, and that's not only a China issue. We're talking about now there's a boosting of coal and steel production and stuff within the entirety of East Asia and Southeast Asia. But a lot of that has to do with our global economy and our thirst for, we need to get our next iPhone on the cheap, or we need to get whatever, this other plastic produced product on the cheap. So we all play a role. It's easy to point the finger at China and say they're the problem, but like we in the West are consuming lots of these products that are made there. And I think that that's just an extremely important point to make, that you wouldn't necessarily hear that much in, we'll just call it like the mainstream media or the mainstream discourse in the United States, but it's important. And that said, China still has a big role to play in getting their emissions down as well. So does India, but so does the United States. And that gets to just my last point about that is, if you look at a per capita basis, the United States is by far still the highest per capita emitter of carbon. And that's important to point out. And that gets to the whole notion of sort of like class. And if you look at climate from a global perspective, just how much more income people in the West have at their disposal than other places in the world. And that kind of answer kind of speaks to how we would try to cover these kind of issues at the Real News as well. So, but yeah, that kind of connects some of the personal to broader political forces.
Merrill.
Sure. With important publications such as Dark Money by Elizabeth Kolbert, progress actually has been made in exposing the nefarious forces that erode climate truth. To what extent do these dark forces of disinformation continue to affect public opinion? And in your opinion, can anything be done to halt their proliferation of untruths?
It's a great question. I think the book Dark Money is actually by Jane Mayer of the New Yorker.
That's right. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
But yeah,
is Elizabeth Kolbert. Thank you.
it's a good but yeah, Colbert is an amazing long time climate reporter, and she's the author of the book The Sixth Great Extinction. I recommend that people check out both of those works. But yeah, Dark Money is just a seminal book on the history of right-wing dark money, and that is like the Koch brothers and other the Scaife family and others, these forces that have lodged themselves within the halls of philanthropic power, of legal power, and of political power to basically create what is the modern Republican Party. But I think the important point is it's also pushed the entire, it's not just, so when you say the Republican Party, it's like, oh, that's this one party and they have their views. But what this whole thing has done, in her book and points it out importantly, is it's moved the whole debate and like the reality of what's possible in the United States rightward about like what the potential policy solutions are. And so I think that gets to this thing that a lot of progressive people say is, oh, well, they have this in the EU, or they have this in, look at Sweden, they have this great social welfare system. They can go to college for almost nothing. Everyone has healthcare. Well, a lot of that speaks to the apparatus that exists in this country. And even talking about those things in the United States, you kind of pointed out as a fringe radical. Well, that's because the debate has been shifted so far to the right by these forces that are outlined. And that's not quite the way she puts in the book. She doesn't really compare the debates in other countries, what I'm saying, but she does say that these forces have been so important for creating what is the modern paradigm of political discourse and political possibility in the United States. And so, yeah, I'd recommend checking out that book. And one interesting thing is that since that book came out, of course, one of the Koch brothers has passed away. David Koch is no longer with us, and so there's only Charles Koch. And the Koch enterprise itself has, just to talk about one portion of what's in her book, because it's a big part of her book, their enterprise has kind of moderated itself a little bit, and they're actually like kind of got more focused on the criminal justice reform. They're not as involved in day-to-day stuff around climate change denial. So it's kind of shifted a little bit more to the left. That said, the Koch machine itself is what is historically the biggest funder of climate change denial, probably besides ExxonMobil, if you crunch the numbers, and Greenpeace USA has done a lot of good work documenting this. So the book kind of talks about all of those things, obviously in much more depth, and it's a really important work of history.
Wow, interesting. Carl?
Steve, let's talk about the pipelines. So big news this last week. We had 3 different pipelines that were exploded, demolished, popular opinion killed them off. Or is that just a delay? Like, tell us what you know about what's happened with the pipelines. They feel like a win in the climate movement, and I don't want to pee all over that and say it's not a win. But what is your understanding of the situation with, are we stopping natural gas strictly because we've blocked these pipelines?
So these decisions on these 3 pipelines were both a win, but also, and I'll mention one way, it might not hear it this way, but I consider it to be a loss, although it's not like a permanent loss, but it's the way that the Supreme Court ruled on Keystone XL. So the 3 pipelines that Carl was talking about are the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which is on the East Coast in the Mid-Atlantic area. The other one is Dakota Access, which is the one that, for those who might not be familiar, was the one at issue in the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, and it crossed into the Missouri River, which is a key drinking water source for the tribe. And so that was huge in 2016, and it's still huge for the climate justice movement into today. But the movement itself became just known as Standing Rock because that's where it took place. And then Keystone XL, of course, has been the one that's been the center of climate activism in the United States, really dating back to about a decade now, since the first term of the Obama administration. And so what happened basically is, to kind of just explain why do these pipelines exist? Why do 2 of the 3 exist, at least in the way that they do or were in the process of existing? And that is because of this permitting program called the Nationwide Permit 12, or sometimes known as NWP 12. It's this mechanism that the Obama administration put into place back in 2012 to fast track pipelines to there were so many holdups because of the movement dating back to 2011 with Keystone XL. Then there was so much activism that grew out of that they found a way to fast track building pipelines that cross waterways of any sort. And they did it through this Nationwide Permit 12 program, which is overseen by the Army Corps of Engineers, normally meant for only projects that are half an acre in size or smaller. But what they did is broke up these pieces into sometimes hundreds or thousands of small pieces, calling them quote unquote single and complete projects. And that is what was challenged within the Keystone XL case today. So the first time it was used was the southern half of the pipeline under the Obama administration in 2012. It's been used many, many times since. I don't remember the number, but it's been thousands upon thousands of miles of pipeline have been laid into the ground in the United States because of this permitting mechanism. What happened is a judge in Montana, a federal judge that was actually appointed by Obama, he ruled that the program itself, this was back in April, it should be tossed out. It basically creates violations of the National Environmental Policy Act, which is our bedrock environmental law, and Endangered Species Act, and all these other, because things aren't considered the way they should be, because it's a fast track mechanism. So it's kind of, NEPA is the federal equivalent of CEQA, which maybe people might be familiar with here, which is the California Environmental Quality Act. And it allows public participation, public concerns to be laid out. So between April and now, there was massive industry concern over this. The industry was saying this is just going to be fatal for our building pipelines, and we're going to lose billions upon billions of dollars. And so there was this weird second quarter of the year where the industry wasn't sure if they could even build pipelines anymore in the way that they wanted. What the Supreme Court ruled was this program should be allowed back into play, but for Keystone XL itself, it should not be. So Keystone XL is still on hold. The program itself is back in play, though. And so the industry, it's kind of weird to say this, sounds contrarian, but if you look at American Petroleum Institute, you look at the Association of Oil Pipelines or American Exploration and Production Council, these kind of groups are out there saying that this was a big win for them, actually, that Supreme Court ruling. And I think that's important to point out, because the big thing at play here is still this nationwide permit 12 thing that has existed for the past 8 years and made it so much easier for the industry to get its way and basically do a runaround for the public being allowed to participate in these kind of decisions. That's really what it's democracy that's been under attack these past 8 years with this nationwide permit 12. And so it was a big victory is what I'm saying back in April. Now it depends on what happens down the legal system. And I think that the big thing at play here is still the way that nationwide permit 12 has been used. And there's been various attempts to stop that by groups like the Sierra Club and NRDC and the National Wildlife Federation. They've been trying to get wins because they realize that it's screwed up the way it's been used, but they almost got this huge win, and now it's been rolled back by the Supreme Court. And that's the long answer. The short answer is these are still monumental wins for those who were on the front lines fighting against Dakota Access, or those who were on the front lines all these years fighting Keystone XL. These are indigenous communities. In the case of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, it was a historically Black community that was huge in raising concerns over how that pipeline would railroad over their community and historic areas within their community in Virginia. So I'm not saying any of this to downplay the wins. I'm saying to put it into context that the big thing, which that the industry was freaking out about so much, that nationwide permit 12, that's still in play. But that said, like Dakota Access thing all these things are still ongoing court cases that are worth monitoring. If it stands, it's the first time ever that a judge has said that a pipeline under the ground has to be taken out because it violated NEPA. It's the first time that a judge has ever made that happen. And now the owner of that pipeline, Energy Transfer Partners, is appealing. So none of this stuff is final. It can still be appealed, but it was crazy that this all happened within a 2 or 3 day period, all these different pipelines and court decisions and stuff. And so it's worth monitoring. It's also worth monitoring what happens with the future of this nationwide permit 12 program. It sounds like an obscure, weird issue, but I think that's really the central issue, that they need that. The industry likes it because then the public cannot participate as much and cannot show up and address their concerns. But I think that this shows that nationwide permit 12 also is now for the first time being chipped away at in a way that hasn't happened before.
Wow. I have a question from one of our participants through chat, and it's actually our very own Eve Simmons. And Eve, please don't hesitate to step in and unmute yourself if I don't articulate this question as it's supposed to be. It says, can we ask Steve if we advocates lobby journalists to cover climate more, it would help build pressure to increase that coverage? Are you there, Eve?
Yeah, I can elaborate a little. I think there's a lot of vociferous anti-climate voices that are, they're very vocal. And I'm wondering, and my theory has been, and it seems to work when I've tried it, that if we come with gratitude and we're short and sweet, that is helpful. And I wonder if you find that to be the case. I know FAIR.org, which is Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, I'm sure you're aware of it, is one of the ways you can contact or find contacts for journalists, whether they're weather people or economics people or any way that, especially if there's a slow news day, although there aren't any of those right now, but would you find that might help you or others or your colleagues, especially with potential sponsors or editors that might be more encouraged to do that if they're getting more warm and friendly and quick, input on that, encouragement from the public?
Yeah, well, yeah, I can definitely try to answer that, and I'll just talk. I'll address the organization at play here, which brought this whole thing together, which is the North County Climate Change Alliance. And I know that just because I was doing local reporting for a while, and that's how I met Marianne. As I reached out to her because I was covering the climate action plan stuff in Escondido and the hearings around it, and just sort of learning about what groups were involved and what they wanted to see in Escondido. But thereafter, for example, Marianne had done a good job of keeping me in the loop and telling me what events you all were planning. And I think that's just really important, is just keeping reporters in the loop. I think we always appreciate when, even if we can't cover it every single time, just sort of keeping us on top of what's happening. Because maybe it won't be, you can't cover that one thing, but you can kind of see the way that trends are happening and you sort of see where things are going. So I think it always helps is just, what Marianne does is helpful. It's like, it just, here's our event, and now I'm on the list and I see what's happening. So yeah, I think that's important. And I think it's just important also to know who the editors are, not just the reporters, because sometimes the reporter could say, oh, I don't think it's important, but the editor of the paper will see it and be like, oh yeah, that really fits into something we want to do. Hey, reporter X or reporter Y or reporter Z, can you go cover it? So I think it's good to get to know those people a little bit and just keep them in the loop. Definitely know the editors' email places. Inboxes do get flooded, but I think it's important. Maybe you can have like a initial one-time conversation with someone for like 15 minutes, even, just to fill them in on what you're up to. That way they kind of see, they can understand where you're coming from when they get stuff in the future. So it's not just coming out of left field from them. So that's just, I'm giving some sort of PR advice based on my reporter experience, but yeah, I hope that helps a little bit.
That's super rich. That's good stuff to hear it from the inside. And Eve's actually presented on that to us about how to lobby and get the media to show up to your events or to cover something that's in the news but that's not being covered. So yeah, we appreciate that you've presented that to us in the past, Eve, and we probably need to do a refresher on that, because that's a great way of reminding folks that your voice is powerful in many ways, including lighting up the press. I have another question here. It is, how can credibility be restored to media sources that are not conservative so that people know what to believe on climate change and everything else? It's pretty clear that if Americans are on board with the idea that climate change is man-made, they still seem to be open to denying aspects of climate science.
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's more like there's been, maybe whoever asked the question, tell me if I'm misunderstanding it, but just, I think that the question was more like, how did basically like the climate denial machine, or like the forces of denial, have helped create doubt in what journalists do who cover climate change? Is that sort of the question, and what can be done about it? Is that, or Carl, does that sound right to you?
I think so. I think we're talking about, how do we dispel the myth that everything is fake news? Right.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's a challenge. That's a big challenge of our time, and that's why I answered that question before about why I have some sorrow about the fact that we're seeing cuts in local newsrooms around the country, is because for a lot of people, that's the news source that they trust the most. That's maybe for people who grew up when newspapers were still prolific. That's the thing that showed up on their doorstep. That's the thing that they saw on the newsstand in their community. They covered the things that people knew about, that they saw firsthand. So it's much easier to say something is fake news when you've never seen it or you've never been there. It's a lot harder when it's in something that happened in your own community. Maybe you could drive to that place or ride your bike to that place or walk to that place. So I think that one of the big things that everyone can do is subscribe to if you don't already, try to subscribe to your local newspaper or become a member, like Voice of San Diego, become a member, or subscribe to the San Diego Union Tribune, or whatever it is. I think it seems like a small gesture, but it's actually, if everyone were doing that in their communities, it would be helpful. I think it would be helpful for the vibrancy of democracy at large, because I think that in a lot of ways that's where this whole fake news, calling what is real news fake news, where that came from is that people are actually getting fake news online, because there's this evisceration of the news industry. So they're seeing something pop up on their Facebook that is legitimately fake news and a conspiracy, but they don't know how to separate the difference between what is real news and what is fake news, because even things that are fake news will cleverly call themselves something that sounds real. So I think that still stems back to this lack of like civic engagement that prevails when you don't have a robust local media apparatus. Luckily here in San Diego County, we do a pretty robust local media apparatus, but it's definitely under threat right now with the economic situation. I know that KPBS is considering laying off people right now. I know that LA Times has a furlough day now where the reporters only work 4 days a week and they kind of rotate to make sure they still have 7 days a week of news coverage. So kind of now more than ever, when we're seeing a crisis that's impacting every community in the United States with the coronavirus, and of course what we're talking about, climate change, is going to affect every community. It's important to support that. That is actually why I came from a national perspective before from my journalism. I did local stuff because I found it important enough, and I left for reasons just more economic. It doesn't necessarily pay the bills always to work in local media, but yeah, it's just I can't speak enough to how important it is to have people at your local city council meetings or these county commission meetings or whatever it is. Like when those things don't get covered, people don't even understand mechanically what's happening in their own community or how things come to be. So that's why I find local news so important, and that those are the things that I think need to be covered if we're going to have a more robust conversation on climate change in every community in the United States.
Here's a question that I was going to fire at Dr. Mann, but we kind of ran out of time. But I think that you're actually well suited to try to address this question too. Some fellow climate allies who specialize in communications are rethinking the strategy of arguing for climate change via scientific facts. The point is that people aren't particularly moved by science and data, and folks see 2 degrees rise in temperature in a headline and they think that's not climate crisis, that's a long summer. Instead of some communicators are now suggesting that we focus on people and the harm that they're feeling and will feel. So what's your experience been? You write a lot of these stories. Do you get feedback from people about which ones resonated?
I almost have never done a story on those ones that are about let me take it back. I've written packages for other people who've hosted on these temperature rises, and you have a scientist on, but I feel like it's so hard to communicate what that means to people when you just have a climate scientist on talking about it, unless it's someone as effective of a communicator as Michael Mann. But a lot of climate scientists aren't to his level in articulating the issue. And I think it's much easier, and it will connect with way more people, and it's a more compelling story if you describe how it's impacting communities in whatever way it is, whether it's this pipeline that's being built somewhere, whether it's this compressor station that's being built in Pennsylvania, in rural Pennsylvania, whether it's the actual impacts of climate change, like here in California, telling the story of what happened in Paradise. For example, I saw that there was actually someone who attended who was from Paradise, California. So that was pretty moving to see that someone came to this who was impacted and was a refugee from that particularly devastating and deadly fire in California in 2018. So I think those kind of stories are the ones that need to be told, because as Michael Mann said, and I like the way that Bloomberg News frames it, they have a section, it's not called the climate change section, it's called climate changed. It's here, it's now, here are the impacts. I think that those are the stories that will help move the dial, and those are the ones people can connect with most, when especially that gets to the whole local thing, right? If you can have local reporters telling those stories about here's how climate change is impacting, we'll say like people in go a little bit east of here, Joshua Tree. Well, the Joshua trees are at threat of extinction because of climate change. So if people are hearing those stories and care about national treasure like the Joshua trees, I think people can connect with those kind of things. That's not there's not people, but there are different ways of moving people, and climate change has so many different impacts. But I think those kind of impacts are much more, I'll just to repeat the word, impactful than just talking about the statistics and oh, this will melt Arctic sea ice and all that, because those are kind of abstractions versus the reality of the impacts are much more apparent when you point them out in that other way.
Okay, good answer. Thank you. I think we're about wrapped here, folks. I wanted to share this also, that Steve, Michael Mann wasn't the only one that gets a treat tonight. So Marion has dedicated a treat for you as well. And so we'll be getting you this certificate so that you can go visit your tree at some point in the future. And it does, help. It does help bring home that point that we talked about earlier, that afforestation, Cody's question, there's a lot of aspects to this, and we can't get too focused on any one particular one. We have to consider a lot. So, but Steve, thank you so much for joining us tonight. You're a good local member, and so people should, know to reach out to you as well when they've got climate stories. Steve is local, so he's covering stuff nationally, but we definitely want Steve to be our ally in helping to get the word out and things that are happening here locally too. So please think of Steve as an asset in our climate communications, toolkit here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And what I'm doing right now is, before I forget, for those who can look at the chat, I'm going to type in my information here. If you want to ever reach me, I'm going to put my email address at The Real News. I'm going to put my Twitter, and I'm going to put my Facebook if you ever want to reach out, any of those, if you have just questions or if you have story ideas or just want to chat. I'm going to put that information here. So I just put it there for anyone who wants it. You can now reach me. And yeah, thanks so much for having me. Like I said at the beginning, you do really important work. I really appreciate the emphasis on education, because I think it's always important to keep talking about the issue, not only doing activism, but continual education is such an important part of this kind of work. So yeah, thanks so much, and I really appreciate everyone for taking time out of their day to attend as well.
Thank you.
And we'll be sending out a follow-up email. Marion graciously does that for us. Meryl's going to be putting this video up online so that you can share it with your friends and family and hopefully your colleagues that you work with in climate. We need to share our assets, right? And share these webinars and let people know when you've learned something new, or when you have something that is approachable for people to view. This is how we get the word out and spread the news. This is how we get other people to come and speak for us. Is they learn that we're doing this good work, and they say, well, I can speak to you, I can present to your group. So we hope that you take that email, open it up, read through it. We'll include some links in there, so you can learn about Dr. Mann's books that he's published, and we'll have Steve's information in there to share, so that you can reach out to Steve with any hot tips that you have for stories, or maybe pick his brain about something that he's done in the past. So I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. It's been a long 2 hours, but I think it's been really fun and informational. So thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you again next month on the second Thursday.
Yes, one more plug to continue the good work that we're doing. It's going to be a very good event on the 13th of August, and we're switching back to 5:30 p.m. Pacific time, and it should be a very provocative talk by Dr. William Calvin. So thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.
Have a good night.